The distant howl echoed through the cold cave walls, a premonition, not a lament. Outside, the night was an open wound in the world, bleeding darkness. An iron smell of fear and blood permeated the damp air. Inside, the flickering flame of the campfire barely pierced the dancing shadows, revealing faces painted with anguish. A deep growl tore through the silence, followed by a muffled scream, and then only the chewing sound of darkness swallowing another life. The cradle now was a tomb. The air inside the echo cave was a dense mixture of campfire smoke, sweat, damp earth, and a persistent metallic scent of dried blood. The uneven, cold, and rough walls were sporadically illuminated by the dying flames, casting elongated and distorted shadows that danced like ancient ghosts, each movement an invitation to the fear that clutched at their throats. Their bodies lean and strong, sculpted by the harshness of survival and the constant threat of hunger. It wasn't a predator, but something that held them equally captive. A pile of bleached bones, remains of ancient prey and of their own kind. His eyes, dark and deep, were fixed on the cave entrance, where a small group had gone out in search of water, an essential task for life, but now a deadly risk that could cost everything. A sharp howl, closer this time, cut through the air, a sound that chilled the blood in their veins, coming from the depths of the darkness. It was the sound of something approaching rapidly, something large and hungry, with a clear and lethal intent. Theron gripped the piece of wood he used as a club, his knuckles white, the wood groaning under the pressure of his fingers, his only weapon against the terror. Cale, with the obsidian already sharpened in her hands, felt a wave of adrenaline course through her body, a feverish heat in her veins, preparing her for what was to come. She knew the obsidian was her only chance of defense, her only hope of fending off the inevitable, of surviving that night. But would it be enough against what was out there? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the darkness outside seemed to thicken, swallowing any glimpse of light, promising a night of terror. A grim reminder of life's brutality, of the sacrifices made, and the inevitable losses they faced with each sun cycle. A small child whimpered, clutching its mother's leg, the sound amplified by the cave's echo, an innocent lament in a cruel and merciless world. Cale felt a knot in her throat, the same sense of powerlessness she felt when the lion's roar echoed across the savannah, tearing through the air and their hearts, announcing death's arrival. She remembered the last hunt, the scream of her younger brother, taken by the shadow of the night, a painful echo that still resonated in her soul, an open wound that refused to heal. The loss still burned, a constant ember in her chest, were covered in a thin layer of soot and dust, as if the very dust of time had settled upon them, marking them. Their eyes, wide and red from the smoke, scanned the darkness beyond the reach of the flames, searching for any sign, any suspicious movement that might indicate the approach of an invisible danger. The anguish was palpable, a heavy veil that covered each face, stifling any glimmer of hope and replacing it with a visceral fear. The fear of darkness, of invisible predators, and of their own precarious existence was a constant burden, a weight they carried in every fiber of their being, from sunrise to the deepest shadow of night. A Homo habilis female named Cale was among them, her thin, skillful fingers manipulating a piece of obsidian, transforming the raw, shapeless stone into a sharp tool, a symbol of her ingenuity and resilience, a glimpse of control in a chaotic world. She wasn't tall, but her eyes held a keen intelligence and an unusual determination, a spark of cunning amidst the darkness that surrounded her, a flicker of life in a sea of despair. Cale felt the tremor of the ground beneath her feet, the vibration announcing the passage of something large and dangerous, a creature of weight and deadly intent, a walking shadow. Outside, the night of the African savanna 2.4 million years ago was an impenetrable cloak of blackness, punctuated only by the ephemeral gleam of predatory eyes in the darkness and the incessant chorus of nocturnal insects. a constant hum that seemed to accompany the accelerated beating of their hearts within. Silence, when it came, was more terrifying than any roar, a prelude to a silent hunt, or the approach of something even older and hungrier, something that made no sound until it was too late and the predator was already upon you. Recent rains had turned the cave floor into a sticky mud where fresh tracks of hooves and claws mingled with the bare footprints of the hominids. Silent testimonies of past encounters and desperate escapes, a macabre record of the struggle for survival. The smell of something rotten, but also of wet earth and decaying leaves, brought back memories of unsuccessful hunts and painful losses, grief always present. The buzzing of mosquitoes was an irritating and constant lullaby, a soundtrack to the despair that spread through the heavy air. In the center of the cave, around what remained of the campfire, a group of hominids huddled together. Suddenly, a movement in the deepest shadows of the cave caught Cal's attention. "Where is he?" An older male, named Theron, growled, his voice hoarse from shouting, from crying out into the void, a sound of contained despair. The sound of the wind lashing the trees outside, mixed with the distant bellow of some solitary herbivore that seemed to cry out to the darkness. A primal lament lost in the vast silence of the savanna was almost inaudible inside the cave, muffled by the tension that hung in the air, dense and suffocating like a cloud of smoke. The acrid, irritating smoke filled Cal's nostrils, and the icy dampness of the floor seeped into her bones, making her feel every fiber of her being, every accelerated beat of her heart. The shadows cast by the flickering campfire flames danced on the cave walls, transforming the rocks into grotesque and menacing figures, each one a harbinger of doom. Seconds later, a stumbling figure emerged from the darkness, wounded and panting, dragging itself into the cave, a specter of pain and terror, its face disfigured. It was Molly, one of the females who had gone out in search of water, her face disfigured by terror, a deep cut bleeding on her shoulder, the flesh exposed and torn, a sight that turned one's stomach. She barely managed to stammer out a few incomprehensible words, broken sounds of despair and warning, before collapsing on the ground, consciousness draining away, leaving a trail of blood and dread on the muddy cave floor. Theron rushed to her, his eyes wide with horror, a silent scream trapped in his throat. The silence that followed was filled only by Molly's gasping breaths and the crackling of the campfire, a cruel contrast between the life that was fading and the little hope that still remained, as if the very demons of the night were dancing for them. Her eyes, now more than ever, carried the flame of courage, a fire that burned amidst the despair, a light in the darkness. The fury at Molly's pain, at the uncertainty of what had attacked her, began to dominate the fear, transforming it into relentless determination, a rage that propelled her forward. She saw the dark stain of fresh blood at the cave entrance, and a trail of colossal predator paw prints, marks of a monster that walked among them. The iron and putrid smell intensified, coming from outside, a breath of death that invaded her lungs. They. The great tooth, Molly whispered before completely passing out, the words echoing like a curse, a prophecy of terror. The great tooth. Terror invaded Cal's heart. She knew what it was. A saber-toothed tiger, a nightmare creature, the supreme predator of that era, a living legend of terror that now became reality before their eyes. Cal knew that the night had just begun, and that the true danger was yet to come, hidden in the shadows that now completely surrounded them, closing in, and the cave, which should have been a refuge, had turned into a deadly trap. The smell of recent rain and wet earth was strong, mixed with the animal odor of sweat and fear, an unmistakable fragrance of vulnerability and terror. The total darkness outside the cave entrance seemed to pulse, alive, as if the shadows waited to swallow anyone who dared to venture out, an endless abyss of dangers, promising oblivion. Every now and then a dry sound of branches breaking in the nearby forest or a rustling of leaves made every muscle in the group, turning them into statues of terror, paralyzed by the anticipation of what would come next. The wait for the explorer's return was a silent torture, each second an eternity that dragged on, testing the resilience of their souls. Theron's eyes, fixed on the cave entrance, were bloodshot, fury and despair battling for supremacy in his gaze, an internal struggle reflected on his face. He mumbled something inaudible to himself, broken words of frustration and plea, his hand gripping the polished wooden club, his knuckles white, the wood creaking under the pressure of his despair. Cale, for her part, was immersed in intense concentration, her mind focused on the obsidian, on the promise of protection it offered, a small glimmer of hope amidst the darkness. She felt the cold, smooth texture of the stone in her hands, each sharp edge promising protection, but also danger, a delicate balance between life and death. Her gaze shifted between the tool and the darkness outside, her mind trying to predict the unpredictable, the movements of the invisible enemy. Anxiety was a tight knot in her stomach, a visceral fear that consumed her from within, a chill that radiated from her soul. She remembered the elders' tales of night creatures that moved like whispers, invisible until the moment of attack, beings that fed on fear and hopelessness. The dread of not knowing what they would face was almost as paralyzing as the confrontation itself, for the unknown was the greatest of monsters, the most feared. Suddenly, a sharp, desperate shriek tore through the night, a sound that echoed in the cave, piercing everyone's ears, a cry of agony that chilled their blood, bringing terror into their hearts. Cale stood up, the obsidian held firmly, the blade now an extension of her own will, a symbol of her determination. The wind, once a distant whisper, now howled at the cave entrance, a chilling lament that brought with it a biting cold and a damp smell of earth and decaying prey, an odor of ancient death that permeated the air. His frustrated murmurs were almost inaudible, the sounds of a man losing the battle, feeling powerless against nature's cruelty. She knew that fire was the only real barrier against the great tooth, the only shield against the terror that surrounded them, their only chance to drive the creature away. But the wood was damp, scarce, and the wind threatened to extinguish what remained of the flames, plunging them into total darkness, at the mercy of the predators. A deep, drawn-out growl echoed from outside the cave, making the ground tremble slightly, a vibration that ran through their bones, announcing the imminent arrival of terror. It was the great tooth, the saber-toothed tiger, approaching, each step a promise of death. The sound was guttural, a harbinger of carnage, a warning that infiltrated their souls, paralyzing them. The other hominids, huddled in the darkest corners of the cave, watched with wide eyes, terror stamped on each of their faces, motionless figures of dread awaiting their fate. "I will go," he said, his voice hoarse, almost a whispered acceptance of fate, a sound of courage and despair, pointing to a dark tunnel at the back of the cave. "There's more wood there and a dry shelter, but there's something else." His eyes shifted to the unfathomable darkness of the tunnel, a glimmer of dread in his gaze, a hesitation that betrayed his fear. The abyss. No one has ever returned from there. The abyss was a legend among them, a deep fissure in the earth's entrails, a place where light never reached, and from where strange whispers were sometimes heard, voices of a forgotten past, or perhaps of something still living down there, a nameless terror. Cale felt a chill run down her spine, a shiver that went from her neck to her feet, a dark premonition. The fear of the great tooth was real, concrete, a visible and palpable enemy. But the abyss, The abyss was the unknown, the unspeakable, a deeper dread that fed on imagination and primal fears. She knew the choice was desperate. Let Mally die, abandoned to her fate, or risk venturing into the most dangerous place that existed, a leap into the abyss of uncertainty and certain death. Cale saw the despair in Theron's eyes, and knew he was about to enter a hell, a place from which few or none ever returned, an inevitable sacrifice. Cale knelt beside Molly, examining the wound, the torn flesh, the pulsating blood, a sight that made her feel sick. The cut was deep, and the female's breathing was shallow and irregular, each breath a struggle, a sign that life was draining away. Cale's rage mingled with her concern, a swirling vortex of conflicting emotions, a fury against destiny. She felt the injustice of that world, where survival was a daily struggle against hunger, cold, and relentless predators, a brutal and relentless existence where death was a constant companion. The anguish of seeing Molly suffer was almost unbearable, a torment that consumed her, a weight on her soul. The campfire flames, now weaker, danced frantically, casting elongated and distorted shadows that seemed to stretch and shrink with each gust of wind, as if the shadows themselves were alive and in agony, performing a macabre dance. The interior of the echo cave, already damp and moldy, seemed to become even more oppressive, the walls closing in on them, suffocating them. Water droplets dripped from the ceiling and splattered onto the muddy floor, creating a constant dripping sound that mingled with the wind, creating a dark and claustrophobic symphony, a lullaby for the approaching doom. The air was heavy with tension and fear, an invisible mist that choked every breath, and the metallic smell of Molly's blood hung like a constant reminder of the imminent danger, a fragrance of despair that clung to them. Theron, his face contorted with fury and despair, his eyes burning with fierce determination, tried to staunch Molly's bleeding with leaves and moss, a futile attempt to defy the death that approached. "We need fire," Cale hissed, her voice low but urgent, a whispered command that echoed in the silent cave. "He won't approach the fire." Theron stood up, his expression hardened by determination, as if every fiber of his being had turned to stone, ready for sacrifice. The air inside the tunnel was dense and stagnant, heavy with the strong smell of damp earth, mold, and something undefined, almost metallic, that sent shivers down her spine, a feeling that something ancient and dangerous was nearby, waiting in the depths. The flickering light of the torch Theron carried barely conquered the oppressive darkness, transforming the uneven walls into a labyrinth of dancing shadows, each movement a menacing figure, a specter of fear. Icy water droplets dripped from the ceiling and splattered onto the floor, creating a constant dripping sound that echoed in the sepulchral silence of the tunnel. Theron froze, his breath caught in his throat, his body in shock, paralyzed by terror. The saber-toothed tiger charged with surprising speed, its enormous claws lashing the air, capable of tearing flesh and bone in seconds, a fluid movement of destruction. Theron, with a guttural cry of despair and courage, threw himself forward, trying to distract the beast, an act of self-sacrifice, a human shield against the terror. Cale, with surprising agility, threw the obsidian, a calculated move of desperation and precision, a last hope. The sharp blade sank into the animal's front paw, causing a howl of pain and fury, a sound that tore through the tunnel's silence, echoing off the walls. The saber-toothed tiger staggered, turning its attention to Cale, its eyes fixed on her, a wild and uncontrollable fury that propelled it. Her eyes met the predator's, and she saw in them not only hunger, but a primal and ruthless intelligence, a cunning mind behind the bestial ferocity. She knew she had wounded the beast, but also that she had awakened its fury, becoming the new target, and death now pursued her relentlessly. The battle was far from over, and the abyss, even darker and more mysterious, awaited them, an invitation to perdition, a bottomless pit. Cale's eyes widened, dread invading her, a chill running down her spine. It was the great tooth, a saber-toothed tiger, even larger and more imposing than the legends described, a creature of monstrous proportions, an embodied nightmare. Its yellow eyes glowed in the dark like embers, two spheres of fire amidst the darkness, and its fangs, long and sharp as daggers, were visible even in the gloom, a deadly warning, a promise of dismemberment. The predator did not roar, but a low, deep growl vibrated in the air, a sound that chilled the blood in their veins, a guttural warning that paralyzed the soul. The smell of fresh meat and blood, exhaled by the animal, was strong and nauseating, an odor of imminent death that suffocated them. A macabre reminder of the damp and hostile environment, a ticking clock to death. The distant sound of the wind howling at the main cave entrance was a constant reminder of the danger outside. But the tunnel seemed to hold its own secrets, its own hidden monsters, an even greater challenge. Kale smelled the sweet and nauseating odor of decomposition, a smell she knew well from the carcasses predators left behind, a vivid reminder of death lurking in every corner of that primitive world, without pity or remorse. Theron, in front, moved with instinctive caution, his muscles tense, his body on high alert, like a stretched rope about to snap at any moment. Every step was deliberate, testing the ground before bearing his weight, to avoid any invisible trap, any hole that could lead him to his end. His eyes, wide with fear but also with determination, scanned the darkness ahead, searching for any sign of danger, any shadow that moved unnaturally. The fury in his heart was a flame that propelled him, a fury against powerlessness, against nature's brutality, against the relentless fate that seemed to pursue them tirelessly, a force that kept him moving. Kale, right behind him, felt the same mix of fear and anger, a whirlwind of emotions in her chest, battling for supremacy. Her fingers gripped the obsidian firmly, the sharp blade, now an extension of her own will to survive. A link between her life and death, her senses. Heightened, every sound, every smell was registered and analyzed in search of signs of danger, of an invisible threat. Suddenly, a movement in the shadows ahead. Not a sound, but a massive, dark silhouette, moving with lethal grace, an invisible predator now revealing itself. The attack was swift and brutal, a blur of fury and claws moving with deadly precision. The deafening roar of the saber-toothed tiger echoed through the tunnel, reverberating off the damp walls and making the ground tremble violently, a vibration that went from their bones to their souls, seemingly shaking the very rock. The smell of sweat and fear on her own skin was almost unbearable, a pungent odor of panic that clung to her. She needed an advantage, something that could disorient the beast, a cunning that would overcome brute force, a survival strategy. Her eyes swept the tunnel and fell on the deepest darkness, where the abyss began, a fissure into the unknown, a bottomless chasm. A desperate plan began to form in her mind, a risky plan, but the only chance they had, the only possible way out. She needed to lure the beast into the abyss, into the fall, into the void that stretched below. But the abyss was a place of legends, a bottomless pit from which strange whispers and ancient laments were said to emanate, whispers of lost souls, or perhaps of something still living down there, a nameless terror, a forgotten secret. What if there was something else down there? Something worse than the great tooth itself, a nameless terror that surpassed any imagination. Her eyes, fixed on the predator, searched for an opening, a weakness, a vulnerable spot in the armor of muscles. The animal howled again, this time with a sharper pain, a sound of agony, and recoiled a step, disoriented by the pain. The saber-toothed tiger, in its blind fury, couldn't stop in time. With a final roar, a sound of despair and condemnation, the beast plunged into the darkness, its massive body colliding with the chasm walls. A sound of destruction that reverberated throughout the tunnel, a cascade of rocks and flesh, until the sound disappeared into the depths, swallowed by the void, by the endless abyss. An eerie silence settled, broken only by the distant echo of the fall. A sound that seemed to stretch for an eternity, a reminder of what had just happened. Kale and Theron, panting and exhausted, looked at each other, their faces marked by battle, by pain, and by victory. They had won, but the cost was high. The physical and emotional exhaustion was overwhelming, and the adrenaline began to drain away. And from the depths of the abyss, a faint, almost inaudible whisper seemed to emerge. It wasn't the sound of the wind nor of the water. It was something more, something ancient and perhaps awakened, a voice from an immemorial past stirring in the depths. Cale felt a chill down her spine. The victory suddenly seemed to have a bitter taste, a premonition that the worst was yet to come, that this was just the beginning of a new mystery. This was the opening Cale needed. She ran towards the abyss, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the tunnel, frantic beats amidst the silence, rushing towards her destiny. The furious tiger pursued her, its yellow eyes fixed on her, a wild and uncontrollable fury that propelled it. The smell of decomposition and damp earth intensified as they approached the chasm, a smell of forgotten depths and of something that lay beneath. Cale could feel the cold draft coming from the depths, an icy breath from the underworld, a warning of what awaited her. The fear of the unknown was paralyzing, but the need to survive was greater, a primal instinct that overcame dread and propelled her forward. And claws, a place where she could deliver a decisive blow. Theron, despite his wounds, crawled to try and retrieve the torch, his face contorted in a grimace of pain and determination, each movement a sacrifice, a supreme effort. He felt the powerlessness of not being able to fight on equal terms against such an imposing creature, and that frustration drove him, a rage that transformed into strength, into a burning desire to protect. The despair of protecting Cale was even stronger than his own pain, a primal impulse of care that moved him. The smell of blood intensified, mixed with the hot, putrid breath of the beast, a smell of raw meat and death that filled every corner of the air. Theron's torch had fallen to the ground, and the dying light revealed flashes of the battle, the colossal silhouette of the predator against Cale's agile figure, a deadly dance in the gloom, a ballet of life and death. The sound of the tiger's claws scraping against the rocks was like 1,000 sharp blades, a sound that grated on their nerves and made their teeth clench, and the rustling of its fur against the stone created a terrifying friction, a sound of violent and desperate rubbing. The air was saturated with dust and adrenaline, an invisible mist that choked their breath and blurred their vision, and the dripping of water in the depths of the tunnel seemed amplified by their dread, each drop a beat of a frightened heart, and relentless clock counting down to the end. Cale, with the desperate agility of one fighting for survival, dodged the tiger's fierce attacks, her lean, strong body moving at a frantic pace, a blur in the darkness, a moving shadow. Cale knew she couldn't win against the great tooth in a direct confrontation. Its raw strength was overwhelming. With a cry of rage, Cale lunged forward, attacking the tiger's wounded leg with a sharp piece of rock, an attack of pure fury and desperation, a war cry against death. At the edge of the abyss, Cale stopped abruptly, at the very last second, her body frozen by the decision. Exhaustion weighed on Cale and Theron like a shroud, their bodies aching and bruised, every muscle protesting, every step in agony. The silence in the tunnel, after the great tooth's fall, was almost as oppressive as the beast's roar, a deafening void that had settled in their minds. The smell of dust, sweat, and blood still lingered in the air, a persistent reminder of the battle. Molly, though weak, was still breathing, her breath shallow, but a sign of life, a small flame that still burned. The warmth was a solace, a welcome breath of peace for her aching muscles, but her mind was far away in the depths of the abyss. She remembered the whispers that seemed to emerge from the darkness, the strange sensation that had swept over her when the beast fell, a vibration that seemed to come from a very ancient place. Something stirred down there, something that made her wonder about the deepest secrets of that world, the mysteries that the earth held within its entrails. She knew that the great tooth's fall was just one chapter, a victory in a larger war, a small step in an endless journey. The journey of the first humans, their struggles and discoveries, was just beginning. A hard and uncertain path, but full of possibilities. And the cave, which was once a cradle and almost became a tomb, would continue to be a precarious sanctuary in a hostile and merciless world, but also a starting point. Cale knew that the past held even greater secrets to reveal, mysteries that only time and courage could unravel. And she, with her sharpened obsidian and keen intelligence, was ready to face them, to uncover what the abyss held, and what the future, uncertain and dark, would bring to her species. The adventure was just beginning. Cale's eyes met Theron's, and a silent understanding passed between them, a bond forged in adversity, in shared terror and overcoming. They had faced the most feared enemy and survived, united by the near-death experience. But victory was not absolute, and they knew it deeply. Life in that world was a constant struggle, an endless series of challenges, of dangers lurking in every shadow, at every dawn and dusk. The next day would bring new threats, new uncertainties, and the anguish was still there, but now mixed with a sense of triumph and renewed determination, a flame that did not go out, that burned brighter. But now there was a new, subtler odor coming from the abyss, a smell of damp earth and something indefinable, almost as if time itself had been trapped there, forgotten, a fragrance of bygone eons that invaded their senses. The light of the torch that Theron finally relit flickered faintly, casting elongated and distorted shadows that seemed to dance in a grim farewell, the ghosts of a brutal combat that had ended, but whose memories lingered. The sound of water dripping from the cave walls was the only constant sound, a melancholic reminder of the passage of time, a slow and incessant ticking that accompanied them on their return. Cale felt immense relief, a weight lifted from her shoulders, but also an unknown weight in her heart, a feeling that something more had changed. They had survived, but at a terrible cost, and the path ahead was still uncertain, full of unknown challenges. Molly was still in danger, and food and water supplies were scarce. Life on the savannah always on the brink of scarcity, a constant battle against hunger and thirst. The journey back to the main cave seemed interminable, each step a pain, each breath an effort, as if the air were denser and heavier. They dragged themselves, leaning on each other, through the dark and damp tunnel, their bodies moving by sheer willpower, driven by the hope of finding refuge. Cale caught the familiar smell of campfire smoke coming from the cave entrance, a smell of home, but also of uncertainty, of a battle that had been won, but which did not guarantee the next victory. Upon reaching the main cave, the other hominids greeted them with a mixture of shock and relief, their faces illuminated by hope and fear, a duality of emotions. Cale sat by the campfire, watching the flames dance and crackle, offering comforting warmth and light.